So thank you, Austin. And it's great to be amongst friends and some consider family, been around forever. So it's good to be home. And Angel, y'all got a good leader to replace Otis. We've gone to Greenwood every year, so this drive was a lot easier. Usually, you got to get up at the crack of dawn or before the crack of dawn to get to Greenwood for the morning meeting in Greenwood. So it's good to be here with you. And this is actually the only one we're doing in person. The rest of them we're all doing virtually for the first time this year. So it's gone well in some places, and then some places, I think the in-person event probably works better. But this is our Grassroots Tour, and I'm going to have you out of here by 9, so that's my goal. So Otis, when I get about 5 minutes out, you just give me the hook. Every year, the state chamber's been doing this for years. Before I got there, when Otis was leading the state chamber, we go around the state and get feedback. And the Grassroots Tour is how we do that. And we do that with our local chamber partners. So when you talk about what the Grassroots Tour gives the state chamber and our leaders, Lou Kennedy, who's the past chair, it gives us those big items that the business community is talking about. Whether I'm in Beaufort or whether I'm in Greenville or Lexington or Aiken or Rock Hill, we hear the same things on big issues. It also is not coming from just one industry sector, so we're not just hearing it from manufacturers or just hearing it from healthcare. We're hearing it across industry sectors. And it's items that we then take and we take to the General Assembly. It's not the only couple things that we work on. We work on a lot of different issues with our local chamber partners and others. But it's those couple of big items that we take and we ask for them to focus on. I think Otis would tell you when he started doing this, there were 15 or 20 items that ended up on the competitiveness agenda. And then they found out that infrastructure, roads, every year was at the top of the list. And every year the General Assembly said, we just couldn't get to it. We got to these other things. So they said, well, let's give you one thing to work on, right? So infrastructure eventually got done. And it's because of the focus on those one or two big items. I'm going to walk you kind of from the bottom of the slide up. So how do we finalize the agenda? Our board ultimately approves it. They'll do that in November. And our policy committees will take what you give us here and vet. But really the Grassroots Tour that happens from August to October, we do 21 or 22 of these around the state. That's really where we get the information we need, and then we survey our members as well. So this is important. We'll go through this and you'll see kind of what we worked on last year and what we're headed into this year. So if you look back and you think back a year ago today, nobody knew what COVID-19 was, right? The social injustice issue that's come and kind of taken the country, and as that dialogue's occurring, people weren't talking about that. The state was actually sitting on the largest budget surplus in state history. So revenue was coming in. We were focused on two items last year. One is workforce development, and it wasn't the workforce development we're probably talking about today, which is getting people back to work. It was, how do I find employees? If they'll just show up to work and pass a drug test, I can train them to do what Lou does at Efron. She's done that over and over again. We were talking about taxes. So our tax code, when you look at it, the Tax Foundation in DC, an independent think tank, they rank states based on tax competitiveness. When you look at us from a business perspective, we're in the low 30s, so we're not competitive. North Carolina and Georgia are doing better than we are, and we've got to do better. So we were working on several issues. The business license tax bill, which we've been talking about since Otis was in charge. We finally have a compromise bill that's not everything the business community wants, not everything the local governments want, but it's a compromise that we can both live with. It passed the House unanimously. It's passed the Senate subcommittee. Ronnie Cromer's been the champion for that. He's really been the shepherd in the Senate for that. It's passed the Senate subcommittee. And in Senate Finance yesterday, it was advanced out, but there's one issue that's left to be debated. And it's not something that the local governments want. It's not something the business community want. Local governments are using third-party private sector tax collectors, most of them right in North Carolina. And they're basically just saying, go out and find anybody that you can find that owes us taxes and we'll pay you a fee. And in a lot of cases, it's 50% of what you collect. So we all know that, that means they're very aggressive. They're right now asking for proprietary taxpayer information. And we think that information ought to be protected. We think that the cities can engage them, but they shouldn't be hired on a contingency fee basis. And then the education bill. So that was a lot of conversation. If you think about a year ago, education reform, a lot of conversation about that. It passed the House, it's sitting in the Senate, and it's not likely to get any more attention this year right now. And then we talk about March, the pandemic hits, and the budget surplus wasn't completely wiped out. There's still a surplus, but it's not going to be close to the largest in the state's history. We worked on a relief and recovery agenda that we've shared, and two big items that we put in that agenda have actually already been adopted. The first was broadband. So rural broadband is an issue that we talked a little bit about last year and has been no more apparent now, whether you're doing e-learning with Dr. Little. He can tell you how many kids don't have access at home either to the facilities, the infrastructure needed to do it, or the equipment needed to do it. When you talk about telehealth, telemedicine, that's become a bigger piece. And then also when you talk about telework, how many folks have worked from home. And really this came to fruition. Lou and a group of state chamber folks went to DC, and we sat down with Congressman Clyburn. And Lou said, what can you help? She was the chair at the time. What can we help you with? And he started talking about broadband. And Lou said, hey, it makes sense. So we've been working on that, and some CARES Act funding was used there that will hopefully help. And then I will tell you that it's a bipartisan issue. It's the federal and the state level. There's as much attention around this issue now, and I think that we're going to see some real progress made over the next 18 months. And then the Unemployment Trust Fund. Otis can tell you, coming out of 08 and 09, we had run our trust fund into the ground. I can tell you, when I was in Nikki's office, in the governor's office, the first thing she signed, her first day on the job as governor, I took a letter in there that some of our cabinet said. I took a letter in there. I said, you need to sign this. She said, what is it? I said, we've got to borrow more money from the federal government if we're going to issue unemployment checks next week. And she's like, what, we owe the federal government money? She's like, yeah, how much? I'm like, well, when you sign this, we're going to owe them over $1 billion. And she said, I'm not signing. So, like folks will do. So I left, and somebody's like, what are you going to do? I was like, I'm going to go back in there in about an hour, and I'm going to talk to her again, right? And basically I said, people aren't going to get their checks next week if you don't sign this. So she signed it. She said, that's the last one, don't bring me another one. So immediately Otis and the Chamber and Manufacturers Alliance and other associations were already working on the issue. There were forms, and the trust fund was built back up. And last year I went to a press conference with Governor McMaster where the trust fund, we announced it was fully funded. We had paid off $1 billion in debt, and we had $1 billion trust fund now, which is what we needed. So we were in a good place. Well, if you can imagine what COVID did to it, it started eating into it. And actually, if we hadn't done anything, it was going to be to zero by the end of September. So the General Assembly took $500 million and put a CARES Act funding in the trust fund to backfill it. And that is, all those dollars are paid by businesses. So basically, that's a tax cut. And taxes still might go up on the SUTA side, but if that doesn't happen, taxes go up. And it's really an issue. And we're hopeful the General Assembly, they're talking about putting some more funds in there to help backfill that, because while especially small businesses, while they're trying to get back on their feet, all you need to do is send them a 200% tax increase on their SUTA taxes.
Can I ask, what's the deficit on the trust fund now? Is there a deficit there?
There's not a deficit. So Sarah may know the number, but so when they backfilled this, it really took us up, to $800 million. Now, it's still being depleted, but they're talking about putting another $400 million in there. So it sounds like at the end of the day, we'll be close to $1 billion that the General Assembly will backfill the trust fund. And in DC, with this last round, they're talking about trying to help states with the trust fund. We just want to make sure that, you've got some bad actors out there that are already in the hold of the federal government, that we haven't done the right thing, and that they're going to get all this money and we're not. So that's a conversation that's continued to be had. All right, so the General Assembly will be back in session next week. They were in last week dealing with some elections law stuff, but they'll be back in session at the end of this month. We need for them to pass the business license tax reform bill. It's on the 1 yard line. And if you have a senator that you talk to, Ronnie Cromer's obviously, he was the champion yesterday in the hearing, has been kind of the quarterback on this thing for us in the Senate. And then the second issue, liability protection. So we're going to have a slide in here that talks about that. And Otis, in his new role at the Institute, the legal reform, it's the old Civil Justice Coalition, is working on this issue. you'll see that businesses are at risk in South Carolina when they're not in other states. So other states have done things to pass liability protection, limited targeted for good actors. My family owns a daycare center down the road here. You know, my sister is one lawsuit away from being put out of business forever, right? And you know, as long as you're following guidelines, which changed back in March, they were saying don't wear a mask, right? Now they're saying you got to wear a mask. So as long as you're following the guidelines of the day, it's something that's important. And then e-notary. So a lot of business is done online now. We're one of the states that doesn't have an e-notary provision. The financial institutions are asking for it, and the real estate community is asking for it. So right now there are some folks that don't want to see it happen. All right, so now we'll go through, and I'm going to go through a slide deck, and then we'll open it up at the end. But after each topic that we cover, I'm going to stop. We can drill down on that topic if you want to. So when we talk briefly about liability protection. So 32 other states have already done something. So in some states, in Alabama, the governor can just sign an executive order and protect businesses and healthcare institutions and schools from liability-related claims related to COVID. In South Carolina, we can't do that. They have to pass a bill. So right now, the only 3 states that are in what we call the Southeast are South Carolina, Florida, and West Virginia, which have not done anything to protect businesses, healthcare, schools. And this is a problem. And you know, we've had over 4,000 suits that have been filed across the country. Right now, most of those suits are related to HR. An employee didn't want to come to work because they said COVID, and they said, no, you're safe, you can come, end up in an HR dispute. So a lot of those are HR related, but we're seeing as time's gone on, we're seeing more and more of them turn to, I went to the grocery store, the person that checked me out didn't have a mask on. I then later found out I had COVID. I think I got it in the grocery store, and I'm going to sue the grocery store, right? So we're seeing more and more of that happen. You know, so I'm a nonprofit. I held an event. I did everything. I followed the guidelines. Somebody came back and said they got sick at the event. They can't prove it, but they say they got sick at the event because of these things. And then I sue the event promoter. So we see more and more of that. And you know, here in South Carolina, the reason we haven't gotten it is the trial attorneys have a really strong hold on the General Assembly. And I think Otis can confirm. Florida and West Virginia, same thing. But it's ironic that, you know, you go to a place like Mississippi where the trial bar obviously has a strong hold there as well. They passed one of the strongest bills in the country. North Carolina's passed 2 bills. The General Assembly actually came back on a Sunday to pass the first bill because they thought it was so important to try to reopen, restart the economy. But it's an issue that we have to deal with. And the trial attorneys, you know, some of them are our friends. They just say it's unneeded. We already have laws on the books, and we would just say these are very unusual times. And if you really want to get the economy back started, and you know, during the peak of the pandemic, I'll go back to child care. Over half of all child care centers closed around the state. And I think as Dr. Little can tell you, schools, you know, there's a clamoring, where do my kids? I got to get my kids out of the house so I can go to work. So if we want the economy to restart, we need to provide some of these protections. So it really is being talked about on 2 fronts. One is there's a bill that's been introduced. Tommy Pope actually introduced it in the House. It's a good bill. It's not everything we'd want, but it's a good compromise bill. He actually sat down with the trial bar and they gave him input on it. It's 5527. It's been introduced in the House. It's been sent to a committee right now that doesn't have a chairman, right? So the chairman's got to call a meeting in House Judiciary, so it's a problem. So if you're talking to your House folks, tell them to co-sponsor this bill. And we're actually probably on our scorecard, if we can't get them to take it up, if you co-sponsored this bill, you're going to get points. If you don't co-sponsor it, you're going to be dinged. Because we've got to raise it. And then on the federal level, Mitch McConnell said it's the red line, and it's the issue that he's included in his skinny bill that they're talking about passing. We don't know if it ultimately gets put in place. Mike?
And do you have any stories of businesses that won't come here without it, or businesses that won't start here or expand here because we don't have it?
So right now we don't have any specific stories where people have said, I'm looking at North Carolina or Georgia because they actually care about the businesses and they're going to provide that liability protection. So we don't have that now, but I think we'll probably get some of those as time goes on. But it really is one of those things. There's a map of the country, and it shows people are shaded in that have done something. Right now, South Carolina is not one of those places that seems to care about it.
You could add to that that we have a problem with high utility costs, water costs and things, so there have been quite a few of us pushing to see if we can make that be more competitive along with some of these other things. Because, you know, up until September 1, I paid $9 and something, 1,000 gallons of water. In Florida, I paid $3. So it has been a real challenge for us, and we're growing like crazy. So I think we have a lot of things that we could be more competitive, and there are companies looking at our area, and we need to have the ability to offer those kinds of things to them. And liability during this particular time is pretty important, you know, just to show you've got a really good safety net to come here and do business.
Yeah, so, and good point. So here, and there's obviously a ranking, and I assume that the Institute for Legal Reform at the U.S. Chamber will also use that in their ranking. But this question just says, have you been more concerned about being sued, and it's COVID related, during this time with the pandemic?
I had a friend this weekend, a business owner and physician, said that it's particularly concerning for the medical community because they're expecting some of the biggest lawsuits to come from them treating patients who turn around.
So it's actually, that's perfect, because that's a perfect transition. So there's actually a group of us. The primary concern is the hospitality industry, the retail sector, healthcare, manufacturers, because manufacturing had to stay open and operate, they're essential. But the healthcare, and it's really on two fronts. So hospitals and healthcare providers are concerned on two fronts. One is a patient comes in and they say, you didn't treat us right. You didn't give us a ventilator, or you put us on a ventilator, and that's what, you know, happened. And then also you've got healthcare providers who have said, we're trying to make it safe for you to come in and do work. And some, you know, a provider may say, hey, I don't think we did things right, and I'm going to sue my employer. So there's really on a lot of fronts, the uncertainty is what the concern is. But healthcare obviously is a target, and, you know, attorneys see those as deep pockets, so my guess is you'll see those. The other kind of faction that's been really outspoken about this is the colleges and universities, and specifically the private and independent colleges and universities, because they don't get state money, they're not worried about offending a legislator. So my alma mater, Presbyterian College, has just said we have in-person classes, numbers are really low, they've managed it. Obviously PC is more of a bubble than like Columbia and USC are. But students and the students want to come back to school and then worried about some sort of liability claim. So,
Well, we saw this week, those of us doing COVID testing, we're really handling live virus and positive tests. And so we saw that some of the testing folks at USC got sick and they had to shut the lab down for a couple of days, and we were scrambling to try and get there and help out. But I mean, you're handling potential live virus, you know, 2 feet away from you under a laminar airflow hood and trying to stay safe. It is risky.
yeah. So it's an issue, and we see it here. Any other, good point, Graham, any other comments or points to touch on?
Ted, is the part of this bill expanded at FMLA? Is that dealing?
No, it does not, no. So it doesn't deal with the Medical Leave Act, no. So, and I don't know in DC if Mitch McConnell's skinny bill talks about it at all,
I
right?
didn't see anything.
I don't think it's in there. So next, we'll go to property taxes. And Pete, you come every year and you provide some good input, so I appreciate it. So really South Carolina is kind of the tale of two ends, right? So when it comes to homeowners, everybody here probably owns a home, even Angel, who's still got a house in Greenwood and trying to transition here. Our property taxes are some of the lowest in the country, 50th lowest by the Lincoln Institute's study. So that's on the homeowner side. Now flip it to the business side. If you're a business owner and own your building, and you know, Charleston's used here because it's the largest city by population in South Carolina. And they take the largest city in every state and they rank what it would be if you had a manufacturing facility that was worth $1 million, how much taxes would you pay on it in each largest city? So that's in Boston, New York, LA. Charleston's the 4th highest when it comes to manufacturing property taxes, and that's why we have to do fee low deals, because you couldn't get manufacturers to come to South Carolina unless you did them. But the big guys get the fee low deals. A lot of times the small guys don't. And then this last bullet point, if you're a renter, so if you live in a house that's being rented and you're paying your property taxes, really basically through your rent to the landlord, or if you owned, or you lived and owned in that same house, you pay 3 times more in property taxes to be a renter than you do to be an owner, right? So we've really we've transitioned to two extremes, and it's a problem. All right, so here's the question, and then we'll talk a little bit about it. Should policymakers look to reform our property tax system, protecting some homeowner exemptions, but making it fair for rental and commercial properties?
Got one comment on property tax, as usual. The state of North Carolina has done an excellent job over the past few years. I think that we really ought to look to them for property tax reform ideas. And it's not so much where we rank 50th, 30th, or whatever. The question for me is how correct, how uniform, how equalized those numbers really are in a given location. And from what I've seen and studied to an excess almost, there's a real problem there. And I would hope that y'all would see that a committee set up and to have good property tax reform and include people who are knowledgeable, competent to really study this issue.
Yeah, so we actually hired our foundation, the Chamber Foundation, hired the Lincoln Land Institute, who does a lot of these rankings and is kind of the identified source. They're an independent think tank. We engaged them with the South Carolina Realtors Association, and they've been in the state, and they've done a deep dive analysis on our property.
Over 2 years.
Yes, they've been in the state over 2 years. They picked 10 counties. They picked some fast growing ones, Lexington, one of them. They picked 10 counties, and they spent a lot of time like going through assessment practices and those sort of things. That report's set to come out in a month or so. The realtors have asked for us to wait for the General Assembly to get out of session in September before we release it. But there's a deep dive and an analysis of it, and hopefully there'll be some things that come out of it that policymakers will adopt.
Ted, just to follow a little bit on what Pete's talking about, I think the inequities that exist just in commercial properties, I mean, you can look right here, and I can go right down Columbia Avenue and show you some people that are taxed at 105%, some at 50 or 60%, and it's not because of the no sales factor, it's just how they're being appraised and assessed across the board and all. And I think those inequities, if you look at those, you would raise some, and you'll have winners and losers in this, but in the end, we'd have a more balanced system if our assessors and assessing officials knew how to assess property. I don't think they really go to school like they have in the past and are required, so they don't assess the properties like they're supposed to be assessed to get them up as close to fair market value as they can, which would mean schools and towns and cities could reduce their millage because of rate increases on some properties. And once again, there's going to be winners and losers.
Yeah.
But I mean, there's some big disparities right now,
Well,
huge
people
disparities.
get mad at those of us who get the fee and lieu deals, but
Yeah.
the property that we're on was hunting land that made this county, and the taxes were like $200 or whatever. They paid $200 a year. I know what we pay for the fee and lieu plus the taxes, plus the jobs provided and whatever. So you've taken a $200 piece of property, scrubland, and turned it
I
into,
don't think fee and lose the issue. We understand we have to
yeah,
be
you still got
competitive to do
Dick
that.
Harpootlian and others.
I can show you properties where a Hal Gerard is paying $1 million and he's appraised pretty reasonably. Yet you could have come right here at Walgreens and look at what was paid for it, and it's like 50% of the value that they paid for it. I mean, even after it's been sold and appraised, okay? And it's those inequities that really exist that we need to try to fix and all,
Yeah,
when we start dealing with the appraisal process.
Yeah, and so the Lincoln Institute, they call the 10 counties they drilled down in, they call around, how do you do it in York County, which is very similar to Lexington County. And they called the guy in Allendale, and they said, how do you do it? He says, how do I do what? He's like, I only got like 20 new property transactions a year. He's like, I ride out there in my truck, I walk around, and they let me inside, I go inside. So it really is, you're right. There's the training and kind of the uniformity across even in a county or outside a county is something that needs to be looked at. All right, broadband. So there's 435,000 South Carolinians who either don't have access to internet or the access is not adequate. 150,000 students don't have access to high-speed internet. And that could be because it's not available or because they can't afford it, can't pay for it. And then 160,000 students can't afford service or don't have a computer. So that means they have it. So that's, I guess, the additional. So when you look at that last number, the state's trying to do some things to get the equipment needed if you have access to get on. But the bigger problem is the folks that just, they can't do it from home, right? They have an issue. So here's a question, it's a personal question, right? Since March, has you or anybody in your household had to use the internet to either work, learn, or talk to a doctor since this thing started?
6% of all kids in this state could not be found, Molly Spearman told us at the beginning of COVID. No way to reach them, no way to find out how to teach them, nothing. I mean, we're lucky in this district to have so much access. But one thing, if you remember Congressman Clyburn told us, it's not enough to say that we have internet in Columbia, because you can be right in Two Notch Road and not have internet, but the next door neighbor does. So there's a lot of work to be done where maybe one person in the neighborhood has it, but the 10 other people don't. And so we can't say we're covered with broadband.
Right, so the way the federal maps is if one person in a census block that has high-speed internet, the entire census block gets shaded in. It says that census block has high-speed internet. And everybody else in that census block could not have it, but the one person does, so that's who if one person does, it counts. So South Carolina's got some more advanced mapping than the feds do, and we're kind of a leader on that front, but we've got co-ops working on it, obviously all the providers are working on it, but we think that hopefully there's some collaboration that's going to make some real progress on this front. Any comments or thoughts, any other thoughts about broadband?
I will say one thing, you know, when we think about, one of the traps I think people fall into is that the pendulum has swung all the way over here, and the need for Zoom meetings all the time and you know, e-learning and all this stuff. While the pendulum will swing back as we come up with either a vaccine or some type of treatment for COVID, it's not going to swing all the way back, because people are seeing the efficiencies of some of the things that are already happening, and they're going to keep a lot of those things. I know, you know, we built a online academy out of the ground from scratch in basically 6 weeks, and we have 7,500 kids in it now. Next year, it's not going to have 7,500 kids in it, but we know for a fact, we call it LULA, the Lexington Online Learning Academy. We know for a fact that it's here to stay, because people have thrived in this learning environment. They like the flexibility that learning environment creates. And now that we see that our higher ed partners are also heavily vested in online learning, we predict that online courses at USC and Clemson and wherever else will just continue to grow. So we have a responsibility to our kids to make sure they can succeed in that learning environment as well. So while the pendulum has swung way over here, we cannot expect it to swing back to where it was before this whole thing started. It's going to come back, but it's not going to come back as far as people think it will. And it speaks to a continued need for broadband, a continued need to have access to these things for all of our students. Because again, while we're very fortunate in Lexington 1, you don't have to drive very far before you find some real rural poverty across our entire district. I mean, it's in pockets. We have pockets of poverty here. Right. So that's still an issue. And I would just say, you know, one of the things people would say is, well, when COVID's over, you know, we're not going to nail it. I think the opposite is the case.
Yeah, so like Colonial Life, who's Tim Arnold's our incoming chair, every one of his employees can now work from home. And he says, I do not see a time where they're going to be in the office 5 days a week. They will work from home some. So I think if you see, you know, obviously Graham is a partner with Colonial Life. If you see across like the insurance industry, people transition where you don't have to be in the office 5 days a week.
Who is is there a state organization that's leading this
So there wasn't until we started working on this, and we pulled a stakeholder group together, and kind of Senator Thomas Alexander out of Oconee's kind of become the champion for it. He wants it to be ORS, the Office of Regulatory Staff. which is at the Public Service Commission, or separate from the Public Service Commission. But anything, yes.
Wasn't there like some task force several years ago that was going around the state doing broadband conversations? That's not around.
Yeah, I'm not sure, no, it wasn't related, really.
This was the first big one.
Right, yeah, we created, we made all the providers, we said, hey, if you want to be in the game, you're a provider, because they don't talk sometimes because they're competitors. We said, if you want to be in the game, you need to come sit at the table. And so we've kind of forced some collaboration, which they all appreciate, wouldn't have done on their own. And so there is some momentum from a state perspective.
If you want to get involved, there's a team member at the chamber, Swati Patel, that really was helpful in making the invitations and whatever. Come on,
Yeah.
get involved.
And, you know, we said if somebody's not at the meeting that should be at the meeting, you know, tell us and we'll invite them to the next meeting. This is what, you know, we started with the big group. All right, transition to education funding. So when you look at where we are as a state, obviously at Lexington, we're sitting in Lexington 1's a fast growing school district. So since Act 388, many school districts have experienced slower growth in property tax revenue and total revenue per pupil since it passed in 2006. And I was in the General Assembly in 2006. I voted for it. I was a co-sponsor of Act 388. Otis was at the chamber. The state chamber was the only group, I think publicly, that opposed, said Act 388 is bad for schools and it's bad for business property. They were right? So we've seen kind of the impacts of it. And the fast-growing counties have had their per pupil funding significantly decline. So I will tell you, when I do this presentation in some counties, they don't even know what Act 388 is, right? They actually get more money per student now in a rural county that's getting smaller. They get more money per student now than they did prior to 2006. So they're like, what's the problem? But when you go to York County and Lexington and Dorchester and other fast-growing counties, you know, I always hear when I go to Spartanburg County, they have 7 school districts in Spartanburg County. BMW sits in one of those school districts. So one school district gets the tax base from BMW. The other school districts, which in a lot of cases are getting the kids, a new neighborhood's built, and not a single tax from those houses goes to operate the schools. So that's it. We've disconnected it. And you see that last bullet point. We're the only state in the country which doesn't have homeowner taxes tied to school operating costs. So when you move into a place and you bring kids, I have 3 kids, my house does not pay any taxes to operate the schools. Now, in 2006, there was a swap, right? So we were going to raise the sales tax, so I would pay for schools through the sales tax through my purchases, but it has not performed. The sales tax has not met expectations on what it is, so general tax dollars have to go to supplant that. All right, should the state look at more equitable measures to fund public education? So the Lincoln Institute's looking at this. And you know, one thing that I'll give Lexington County credit is Lou talked about the land that she put her business on, Nephron on, is they've done like a joint industrial park there where one school district doesn't get, Lexington District 2 doesn't get all the benefit of that because Lou's employees, a lot of them live over here. I'm in District 1, so there's a revenue sharing that goes out of that industrial park and some other places around the state have done it as well. All right, I'm going to stop right here. Any comments, concerns, topics we want to hit on with Act 388 or public education funding?
Yes.
Yes.
I agree significantly. This is close to, at this point, it's cost us well over, I think our last estimate was about $250 million since its inception. It's about 25-ish is what it averages out, $1 million a year, but then it increases every year. And of course, the neighborhoods, I mean, my neighborhood that I live in, you see sold. People are moving and it's growing, and it's crazy that none of that goes. I mean, my sister-in-law that pays property taxes in Pennsylvania cannot even begin to fathom our property tax bill. I mean, it is so completely different. Of course, they have, and that impacts us in really significant ways. So that's our teacher pay. It's our, you know, all those things when we're attracting people to be here to keep the quality of education really, really high. That's all the stuff that this would really significantly impact. Now, sometimes I get worried that when I hear an equitable system, that it just means we're just going to continue to lose. But I think for us, it's the idea that if you're a fast-growing district, you need that support in order to, for it to continue over time, because it's not just about quantity, we want it to be about quality.
Right, so, and, you know, I think when you talk about property taxes, which the business community talks about from a fairness perspective, and you talk about education funding, those two things have to be tied together, I think, to get either one of them to get a better system. All right, criminal justice reform. This is obviously being talked about nationally, and, you know, if you look, we look at the Senate and the House have been working on sentencing reform. So how do we keep folks out of prison to, you know, to keep them, divert them into reentry programs as well after they get into prison. And then, you know, we were involved in some nonviolent ex-offender second chance legislation several years ago. And it's something that we continue to hear primarily our larger corporate members talk about. All right, so would you support legislation to reform penalties for nonviolent offenses to expand workforce reentry opportunities for nonviolent ex-offenders? So we think, you know, our folks think that a lot of the effort that could be done that would bear some real good fruit is if we can keep kids who break the law, if we can keep them out of prison, we've got to find ways to keep them out of prison and put them to work, and, you know, that we think that's part of the solution. I mean, obviously there's folks that talk about what to do on the back end after they've already been in prison, but what can we do? And, you know, it could be, there's some controversial stuff in that, right? Can you decriminalize, like, possession of small amounts of marijuana? We know that, you know, historically the African-American community has been hit harder with those laws than the white community can, right? So you've got to look at some things like that. So most of you agree, and we're seeing that around the state. Any comments or thoughts around this issue? All right, and this is the last slide. So diversity and inclusion. So we hear folks talk about the need to implement, make sure we have a diverse and inclusive workforce. We look at kind of the entrepreneurial gap between minority-started businesses and white or Caucasian businesses. The unemployment rate in the African American community had been the lowest of all time at the beginning of the year, and now they've been hit hard. That community's been hit harder with the pandemic. And then we also know through studies that making sure your leadership team is diverse, whether it's backgrounds or race or gender, if you have a diverse leadership team, your business, your bottom line is ultimately better. So it's something that we continue to see folks talk about. We have a forum coming up with some CEOs here in a week or two. I think Lou's on that panel.
We had a meeting yesterday, Dr. Little and I, where Attorney General Alan Wilson and Reverend Jackson from Brooklyn Baptist asked people around the city to see if we could start to talk about dialogue around this topic.
So, so over the last year, has your business taken any action to focus more on diversity in the workforce? And I'll tell you that the larger operations all say yes. Most of the small businesses that I talk to just say, hey, it's just me and two other people, right? If I had an opening, yeah, I'd consider it, but I'm just trying to survive this time. So it's something that you see folks talk about. Any thoughts or comments around diversity and inclusion?
Well, Dr. Little, and I shouldn't keep speaking up, but when we were having this discussion yesterday, there were quite a bit of comments around the culture in companies needs to change. So it's not enough to say, I'm going to hire a Hispanic or an African American or whatever. We also have to be inclusive, a seat at the table. But even more than that, how are we changing the way that we talk to our colleagues and employees? Are we putting in the same effort that we did 15 years ago? Has our mindset changed the way we interact with one another? Are we allowing for that inclusion and so forth? And I believe that from moving back to this state, there's been a lot of change from growing up here and leaving for 35 years. And it's refreshing. But I think there's always, all of us could do better every day. But it's a lot different than growing up in this city, you know, when leaving here in the 80s and coming back. I mean, you know, we see every race, color, and creed in Lexington County, and I mean, you know, we had one Gonzalez whole school. I thought it was exciting, you know, growing up here.
Yeah, no, obviously, and I think, we're going to continue to see that kind of that diversity broaden. So is there anything we haven't missed or haven't talked about that you want to discuss, any topic? Yes?
On the Act 388, like, I've been hearing about that for just year after year after year after year. Here's an election year, and reforming it would impact people's property taxes. And I remember listening to Senator Massey and Mike Cassidy talking about, Bill Up trying to get politicians to vote to increase property taxes and never hope to get reelected. But certainly living here in Lexington 1, and talking to school board members in Fort Mill who have the same sort of issues as we have here, is there some relief that without reforming Act 388, there's just some sort of relief valve that legislators could get on board to help these faster growing school districts?
Yeah, so the Lincoln Institute, and I've read the report, so I know that this is one of their things. I think it's Michigan. They actually have a statewide property tax, right? So let's take SCANA's assets, the power plant, right? And I don't know exactly, even behind the dam happened here. I don't know who gets the taxes on what's behind the dam. Is it District 5 or is it y'all?
I think it's 5.
Yeah, I think District 5. I think I remember that. So SCANA's assets go to power a lot of people outside of District 5, right? Or even their nuclear facilities in Winsboro County. Winsboro's got the most money per student in the state because they got 2 nuclear reactors sitting in their backyard, right? So one of the things the Lincoln Institute says, in Michigan they've done it, is they said instead of, the state invests a lot of money in getting Boeing to come to South Carolina, they used all of our tax dollars to do that. One school district benefits from Boeing, right? So maybe specifically on these larger type projects, is there a way that tax revenue, you got a statewide property tax, that tax revenue goes and then it's funneled back out per student, so per head. So that's one of the things they look at. They also look at, is there an offset? Can you provide some homestead exemption for commercial property and find another revenue source to go back based on student population? Because right now, we have Lexington District 4, they have no tax base. There's very little business to get. Lexington District 1 doesn't do so well. We have a lot more residential and a lot, our balance is not, it's kind of like York County. Our balance is a little different. So if you have a large industrial base in one school district like BMW and one school district in Spartanburg, that school district benefits, but in a lot of cases where the people live are actually disadvantaged. So I agree with you. I don't think they're going to repeal Act 388, and quite frankly, the chamber wouldn't waste our time advocating to repeal Act 388, but we've got to reform the system, and we've got to do it in a way that helps the fast-growing school districts, because really that's who has been negatively impacted by Act 388.
Ted, one last thing. I know when we started talking about transportation funding and all, the DOT came out with under Act 114, how to distribute the dollars based on economic development and all this kind of stuff. There's nothing in there for fast-growing communities and all. I'd like to see the chamber go back and try to amend 114, or at least get them to go back and review it, where the fast-growing communities, which is economic development in some sense, but they don't weight it. And you look at our roads in Lexington County that are being used by citizens going everywhere, just dilapidated.
Yeah.
And the second thing is that they got all this money set aside for interstates and nothing's being done with it. And Richard Jackson says what we should take is some of those monies and fund asphalt improvements in some of our county areas where our school buses are running and where our citizens are trying to get the kids to school and back and forth to work. I'd like to see us go back and try to deal with transportation issues a little bit more in fast-growing communities like where we are, rather than just having to wait another 10 years before we even get to sit at the table on some additional funds.
And I agree with you. I talked to Richard last week about it. He was complaining about it.
We only got repair money. There, with all our roads, nothing but repairs. And I took a picture on 378 of them with one of those bags dumping.
Yeah.
And the minute it rains, it just floats out. I mean, that's no repair.
Yeah. We've still got infrastructure needs. Obviously, the bill we got passed, in 2015, I guess, was a big big boost, but it's not, I mean, we know that it's not enough, but it's a start. And I think as the contractor community starts to say, you can deploy these resources, we have enough workforce and assets to be able to do it, then there'll be another conversation about what needs to be done.
I would encourage everybody here, we've got some wood to chop, because if you go to Greenville, Spartanburg, the roads are going in and they're beautiful, and they're looping and scooping, and they look fantastic. All up in the upper part of the state, you've got beautiful roads in Hilton Head, you've got beautiful roads going in all around Charleston. We don't have any of that going in other than the 10-year-long thing out by Chapin that is gonna be, you know, a long process and way overdue. That was due in the 80s, and it's not even enough. I think it's important for us to talk to the people that represent this county any chance we get, because, you know, we've got a lot of growth and no significant help on the roads, none. But it might be good for Michelin, maybe we sell more tires.
I would suggest, rather than wait on the chance to talk to them, the chamber lead an effort to get our delegation in one room and work together on some of these issues. We can't get them to meet with the county and other municipalities. A lot could be done with our county delegation.
I would agree. I mean,
Believe you me, plenty of us are chirping about it. I just don't know, you know, one voice versus a bunch of voices. You're right, seems to be better. And I will tell you that when Odie took up the mantra even before Ted on roads, and a bunch of us business leaders did that, Michelin, a lot of us 3-4 years in a row, it finally hit home that we're tired of delivering tires over roads like this. And, you know, Pete told us about how many ever exits in South Carolina, you can't even take those big, huge tires because the dang truck will flip over. Because we've got these crazy on and off ramps. It's a problem.
yeah, so there are a lot of problems, right? And that's what the business community has to have their voice heard. And this, obviously, we appreciate it. This helps us focus on what we're hearing around the state, focus on what we're doing.
What do you see as some of the next steps in the education workforce? I mean, I know COVID's.
Be pro, be proud.
Yeah, so I'll mention that. Some of you, Kay was there, obviously Lou's involved in it. So a group of associations, the Truckers Association, AGC, Leslie, who's here, lives here in Lexington, the home builders, and the forestry, Cam's group, and the chamber. We came together really about 5 years ago. The Arkansas Chamber developed something called Be Pro, Be Proud. It's basically a classroom on wheels, goes around to schools, fairs, and it introduces kids to the skilled trades, because, you know, if you're in construction, you know, you have trouble getting people in the skilled trades, and in a lot of ways, those are good paying jobs. It's a career, right? And so Be Pro, Be Proud SC, we actually launched last week, and it'll start going around the state, and it's a way to introduce kids to the skilled trades, but then on the back end, there's a database that it captures and said, you know, Joe said he liked welding or was interested in welding. Then we can follow up in Midlands Tech and the Technology Center. The guidance counselors say, hey, Joe, when he was on Be Pro, Be Proud, his interests were welding and heavy equipment operator. And then they try to link them with career paths coming out of the schools, because we all know that, you know, not everybody wants to go to a 4-year degree seeking institution, and that some people want to work outside with their hands. This gives you an opportunity, and they're really good professions, because that database also will say, did you know in the Midlands of South Carolina there are this many jobs that are in this skilled trade, the average salary is $67,000 a year, and, you know, gives you that sort of information. So we're excited about it. And Lou and Nephron did the trailer. We raised about $2 million to outfit and build the trailer, and then the state provided money to operate the program. So the private sector built the trailer, put the trades on there, and the public sector's going to run it.
Ted, can I ask one more question?
Yes.
On unemployment payments, I know you said the CARES Act, and they talked about putting some more money over there to get us up to 700-800 million, whatever.
Yeah.
What does it look like in the conversations we do as the payments for small businesses as a result of what's transpired? Is there any way that we can lock them in for a year, the prior year, or there's
So-
some benefit that's less than being penalized for what happened during this and having to let people?
Yeah, so we actually, in our relief and recovery package, we advocated and said, hold them harmless for a year for their layoffs. Because if you lay off, you're a small business and you lay off half your workforce, right, so that's a problem. So there isn't really talk about doing that right now. They say they may come back and do that in January, but your account doesn't get hit with your experience rating until the end of the pandemic. So as long as Henry, the governor, doesn't end the pandemic or end the state of emergency, people are held harmless inside this time period. But when he says that the state of emergency has been lifted, that's when folks will get hit with their tax rate. So there's a conversation about it. Yeah. Because not only would tax rates go up 200%, but then you would go from rate class 3 to rate class 18, which means they'd go up another 500%. So it's a problem. Any other comments or questions? It's 9:01, I believe, so we'll let you go. And I appreciate the opportunity to be here, and obviously friends and family, we appreciate being with you. And if we can do something for you, just let us know. Thank you.
Thank you.
Yeah.